Tonight we have Thomas R. Parker as a speaker, but I want to do a little bit of housekeeping first. This is our first meeting of the year autumn of 2024. And you know what tonight's program is. Trudy has a full lineup through December. On October 7, we'll have Julia Follick on how the U.S. immigration system works or doesn't, which should be an interesting thing prior to the election. On November 11, it'll be John Grinspan on Wide Awake, the forgotten force that elected Lincoln and spurred the Civil War. So we're going quite a ways back in history for that one. And then December 9 is going to be Kelly Mensa on The Playwright in the Ring. Kelsey won the Helen Hayes Award for Outstanding Production for her play La Salpêtrière, which was done at Taffety Punk at Shaw's earlier last year, pardon me. And she won the Helen Hayes Award for that. She's a Hill resident, and so she's going to come in and talk about how to be a playwright. It should be quite an interesting evening. I'd also like to thank the people that make this whole evening possible. First of all, Judy Brennan, because for all she does for everything. Mary Bloodworth, because we wouldn't be talking to each other but for Mary. Karen Struck, who does a good job writing these what happens here up for the newsletter, and May Jean Daniels for the publicity. And I appreciate all of your working on this program. Now, tonight we're going to have Thomas Robbins Parker, and he is a university lecturer and international affairs analyst at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. And he has a recent book out that I assume he's going to talk about, called The American Presidents in Diplomacy and War, Statecraft, Foreign Policy, and Leadership. Tom, the Zoom space is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. Can everyone hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, fine. So should I talk for about 15 minutes and then take questions and answers? Or...
Yeah, we'll go till 8 o'clock. So if you want to talk for upwards, I'd say, of a half hour, that would be fine.
Yeah.
You know, in there, okay. 15 minutes to a half hour, and then we'll take questions.
Right, okay. I might do it a bit on the short side.
Okay.
Because the Q&A can be probably more interesting for everyone. So a bit of background on the book. I was in government for 30 years working on international affairs at Defense Department, State Department, CIA, the Hill. And when you're in the government, you don't have time to really write books. And you're not encouraged, to say the least, to work on to write about contemporary issues if you're going to do articles. So I said to myself, well, since I wanted to begin to write something, I said, well, I'll write about George Washington's foreign policy. That should be long enough in the past that it's not too controversial. So I started off with that, and I did an article which was published by one of the journals here in DC. And then COVID came along, and I said, well, why don't I look at some other presidents and maybe even turn this into a book. I didn't have any contacts with the publishing world, so I just sent it out cold, as maybe some of you have or would like to do. And I sent it to the best publishers, or as I saw them. And I sent out maybe about 15 letters of interest. and got back 2 positives, which everyone tells me is very good. But it's, I guess, but publishing a book is a little like falling in love, right? If you fail 99 times and succeed once, you're a big success. So I'm not a big success, but Notre Dame University Press did agree to publish it. It came out last November. And so it's on our iconic presidents and their foreign policies. I just did foreign policy, which is my background. So I did Washington along with Hamilton. Then I did President Lincoln during the Civil War, because there was a lot of foreign policy there, although it's less focused on than the war itself, of course. Then thirdly, I did Theodore Roosevelt, because he, in the late 90s, embodied really the coming of age of the United States. It was the first time that it became a real world power when say, the Spanish War. It took control of the Philippines for several decades. And then I looked at Franklin Roosevelt. There, I didn't look at their whole policies. I looked at his policy just leading up to World War II. And all of them embodied in different ways successful foreign policies, I thought. And so I wrote about, what happened and why they were successful. Then I looked at the Truman policies in the Korean War, just in the Korean War. And that was an interesting example of, I think the commitment was the right thing to do, believe me. But there was a lot of floundering around, and which led to the Chinese intervention. And to me, it was an example of reasonable men who made some significant mistakes, and to remind us that reasonable people can make some pretty bad mistakes. And then I wrapped it up with 4 modern chapters, 2 pretty successes: the Nixon policy during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the President first Bush in the first Gulf War. And then I did some less successful foreign policies, I thought, under President Obama and President Carter. I stayed away from Trump, although I reference him in the introduction as someone who's more interested in the balance of payments than he was in the balance of power. Just because there are very few documents that have been opened yet, and during the Trump times, because they're so reasonable. They're so recent. So that was the structure of the book. What I concluded, which maybe wasn't a great surprise to me, I tend to be, on foreign policy, someone who's generally in the political center. So I concluded that if you're looking at all of these presidents, generally speaking, the ones who are in the political center are the ones who do the best. And the ones to the left, the ones to the right, don't do as well for various reasons. Emotions become intertwined in their decision-making process. They can tend to be excessively conflict avoidant, often on the left. And actually, Thomas Jefferson was a good example of that. Or they can be excessively belligerent. In fact, the young Theodore Roosevelt started out that way. He never saw a war that he didn't like initially, and then he became much more measured and mature once he became president at the young age of 41 or 42. Anyway, that's an overarching conclusion, for what it's worth, that generally speaking, the centrist type tends to be more right than wrong. But, again, not always. And the Korean War is an example, a good example of, fairly centrist leaders there who misread the situation. And what I mean by that, to make it a little more concrete, they initially were not sure they would defend South Korea if it were ever endangered by North Korea. So the communist side, understandably, took that impression and said, well, we can invade and nothing will happen. So they did. And they almost pushed the US and South Korean army off of the southern Korean peninsula. But Truman, I think to his credit, said, okay, we're going to send in troops and fight back. And he did. And then what happened, it swung in the other direction. Some of you may know, Douglas MacArthur was in charge of our forces there. He lands behind the North Korean forces at Incheon, September of 1950. The war has broken out in June, I think, of 1950. He routs the North Korean forces, and then that goes to his head. So we're swinging from excessive passivity initially to excessive aggressiveness, and he tries to go all the way up to the Chinese border. The Chinese intervene and rout the American and South Korean forces initially, and then the dividing lines between them finally stabilize. Anyway, that's just an example of reasonable men getting it wrong. So what does all this mean for the present? It's that generally speaking, I think people kind of in the center, like say the first George Bush, he's generally considered by foreign policy experts as being one of the more successful foreign policy presidents in the 20th century. And I do a chapter on the first Gulf War and why it was so successful. And there's a guy again who's kind of center right. He voted, by the way, for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And I think Biden has done a reasonably good job. He's going to, center left, and he's interested in foreign affairs, as was the first Bush. And you're not going to be, this is a commonplace, but you're not going to be terribly successful at something that if you're not very interested in it. And a lot of our presidents recently have come out of domestic politics with no foreign policy experience. I'm talking about Obama, Carter, Clinton. They were all governors. Trump wasn't even a governor. So, he's no good for various reasons, but no experience or particular interest in foreign affairs, except for narrow aspects of them. And Reagan, you can have opinions vary about his foreign policy presidency, but he wasn't experienced. He was not, again, a governor. And beginning with Carter in 1976, we have chosen our presidents through the primary system, as opposed to party leaders choosing the presidential nominees, and then the voters decide. So beginning in 76 with Carter, who gets the nomination through the primary process, we now are, in my view, kind of stuck with that process. And it means that you don't have party leaders choosing presidents. You have, the electorate, which tends to be somewhat less sophisticated, I think, than party leaders. So I think in that sense, there's maybe been a decline in statecraft, but that's for all of us to have different views on. But again, to resume, I looked at the most iconic presidents, the two Roosevelts, Lincoln, Washington, and Hamilton. Um, Looked at their foreign policies in detail, and then, took the book up to the present. And what is the definition of success in foreign policy? Uh, it's a good question. It's something that, I don't know, makes the world a better place, serves the interests of one's own country, and also the interests of what other countries are being impacted by whatever you're going to be doing. So that is maybe just a general definition. Making the world a better place is very vague, but making it somewhat safer. A lot of foreign policy is, dealing with threat. And that's, I focused on issues that, involved armed force or could involve armed force. This is not a book about, trade negotiations, as important as they are. So that's just an overview, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. Oh, let me, before we do that, let me tell you a funny story. I think it's funny about the title. Okay. The people have told me, they've said, Tom, your book's really well written, except for the title. And I don't know whether it's well written, but I agree with the title. So what's the background story? Why is it such a clunky title? Originally, the title was going to be Profiles in Statecraft, and kind of take off from the Kennedy book, Profiles in Courage. And the publisher reacted the following way. He and she said, great title. But unfortunately, the algorithms don't like the title. The algorithms. And I said, oh, and why don't they like the title? And they told me, well, you got to have a lot of keywords in the title. So it has to be something like American presidents, keyword diplomacy, keyword war, keyword. Then you're on to this, colon, blah, blah, statecraft, foreign policy, and leadership. So it's, it turned out to be this kind of clunky, generic title. Maybe I should have fought back harder to keep the original title, but it didn't happen. So yeah, there it is. So the title is American Presidents in Diplomacy and War. Even I don't remember it. Statecraft, Foreign Policy, and Leadership. Now, if you repeat that 10 times, you may remember part of it. So anyway, and if you were in the publishing world, maybe you've gone through similar experiences.
Okay, Tom, thank you.
Sure.
Maybe we should fire the algorithm.
You can't, they're too powerful. Can't
Who
fight City Hall or the algorithms.
who wrote the algorithm? They didn't say.
Oh, I don't even know if they know.
Okay.
No one
Well,
knows who writes the algorithms,
right.
but they are written. By the way,
Well,
do you
I had a
need,
question.
yeah, sure, go
I
ahead.
had a question, which was of these presidents that prior to, not in the recent past, but
Uh-huh,
say up until the end of World War or into the Eisenhower administration. How
uh-huh.
would you rank these in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 order? Can you say who was the best of the ones you reviewed?
Well, of the ones I reviewed, I'd say the first George Bush was really up there. And in fact, a lot of people, this is not original thought. A lot of people who, write about foreign policy, including Democrats, will say, yeah, he was really good. He was very experienced. Had been vice president, he had been head of CIA, he had been our liaison to either China or Taiwan. So he's up there, I think. And I wrote about the first Gulf War and his stewardship. So, I think Nixon, for all his faults, was pretty good on foreign policy. Now, someone asked about Vietnam as well, you should. And there, I think he probably should have withdrawn more quickly than he did. They tried to salvage the South Vietnam. They thought there may be some massacres, which they were, by the way. Cambodia, 20% of that population was exterminated by the communists. Okay. And that's what the United States was trying to fight against. So, I can understand different points of view on this, but I feel strongly that they should have withdrawn much more quickly than they did. So they withdrew in 4 years. They could have withdrawn in six months if they had been determined to do so. At the end of the day, there was a tough realist centrist guy, Hans Morgenthau. I don't know whether the name means anything to you, a refugee from Europe. And he was one of the few foreign policy experts who was arguing against the war right from the start. And he argued, don't go in and do this. There's a historical, tension between China and Vietnam. And even if the North conquers the South, then there'll still be tensions there, and we can work, with the Vietnamese. And that's turned out to be true. You'll see periodically when articles about the South China Sea, how the Chinese are always pushing their claim, deeply into the South China Sea. One of the countries pushing back against them, and occasionally using armed forces, is Vietnam. So anyway, you asked me about some of the best presidents. Those are two pretty good ones, I think. And again, they both loved foreign policy. And Theodore Roosevelt loved foreign policy. And I think he was one of our best presidents. After he matured, initially, he was kind of a jingoist, before he became president. And then, he was the first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize, as you may know, mediating between Japan and Russia. So I think a prerequisite is to really like the material, like the subject matter. Not every president does. It's.
Well, of the ones you picked, are there who was the dismal failure?
Well, you can point to the Vietnam War, right, and Johnson, and to a lesser degree, the predecessors. They all, Kennedy, Eisenhower, even Truman, they all got slowly sucked into that, which was their fault. The political attitude in the country was such that you didn't want to give up any piece of territory to, the communist side, which, you have to have some flexibility in your foreign policy. And as I write in the introduction, our position during the Cold War was relatively strong and good, in the sense that a lot of countries were friendly towards us because they wanted support against the communist movements, which were kind of on the move back then. And so, you could say to yourself, look, occasionally we'll win some countries, quote unquote, we'll lose them. But, it looks like we're in pretty good straits. And they should have done that, or the electorate should have done that, and say to themselves, look, okay, we're going to lose South Vietnam. We're getting people coming into our State Department begging for intervention. One does have to remember that, because this is maybe the middle class Catholics in particular who were worried about what the North would do. And when they won in 54, there was a lot of there was quite a bloodbath. So it was a complex situation, but it was, if you're looking back over where our policies were the poorest, it was, I think the Vietnam War, which didn't lead to, nothing positive really came out of that, to say the
Okay.
least.
We have a question that you partially touched on, which is it says you haven't mentioned Vietnam, which you just did,
Yeah.
Afghanistan or Iraq, all long and unsuccessful wars that cut across a number of administrations of various political stripes.
Right,
How do
right,
those foreign misadventures fit within your overarching matrix of success by middle of the road presidents?
right. That's a good question. First of all, I'd say these engagements were not total failures like Vietnam was. Okay, so what do I mean by that? If you take Afghanistan, you have to remember 9/11, and it was organized by bin Laden, and he had a lot of money, and he planned on doing many other things of that sort, except that the US intervened in Afghanistan. And he took refuge in Pakistan. We couldn't go into Pakistan after him. And so it took us 10 years to finally track him down and then kill him. So the intervention did score that important achievement. Now, in an ideal world, we probably should have withdrawn right after the bin Laden raid in 2011, 10 years. But we didn't. President Obama was in power. So, and then you have all the negative side to that intervention. I couldn't agree more, like the deaths that were involved in the war on all sides. The and the fact that we tried to put together a, reasonably okay government for that part of the world, but that finally collapsed when President Biden chose to withdraw. So I wouldn't, the war became unpopular, I agree. And you have this forever wars thing and never again and all that. And Trump, of course, said it was awful. And but it wasn't, I don't see it entirely in a negative light.
Well,
Afghanistan. I can talk about Iraq too if you'd like.
right. These modern wars have seem to also be democracy building wars that they end up uh, Iraq, Afghanistan, were after the initial were to build democracy.
Right.
Can we say that all these presidents were idealistic and thought that they could somehow build democracy around the world? Is that a flaw in our foreign policy?
I think it probably is. You have it kind of goes back to maybe Woodrow Wilson, who led the United States into World War One on the grounds of establishing democracies in throughout Europe. And you have to remember the context. The war was in some ways started by autocratic regimes, right? Germany. We were fighting on the side of democracies, the United Kingdom and France. So I'm not saying that's a frivolous goal, but it can be excessively idealistic, as you imply. And I think it became that way, certainly in Afghanistan. In Iraq, I think that's the Bush administration is to be faulted on that. I think, what happened, I think, at least, well, in Afghanistan, we tried to cobble together a functioning democracy, which finally ended up collapsing because it couldn't hold up without U.S. support against the insurgents. And with Iraq, so what happened there you had the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The administration genuinely thought there were weapons of mass destruction there, okay, biological and nuclear. I have, and so did the CIA. I teach this in my class. I have the unclassified intelligence assessment, declassified. It's been declassified, and which they say he's got this and that and this and that. And actually, as an exercise, we go through this and say, why did they make these mistakes in their intelligence assessment? And you come up with you come up with reasons as to why they did. But they genuinely thought that was the case. This kind of worst case scenario. So Bush goes in. Within a year, they discovered that Saddam, he doesn't have WMD. He has destroyed it. Okay? He destroyed it without telling anyone. Now that sounds weird, right? The reasons for doing that, though. Destroyed it without telling anyone. So then Bush could have just said, look, people, I went in, I assumed it was there. Apparently he destroyed it without telling anyone. So, we're going to leave. But he didn't do that. He went in and he said, we're going to try to build a democracy. And I think thinking that it would appeal to the American people. But, the American people, and I don't, really blame them, you got to produce results quickly, if you're going to build democracy. And they're not going to hang on to a project for a long time if there aren't observable, concrete, forward movement. And Iraq is, in its limited way, a democracy now. So he succeeded in that. But, at the end of the day, people don't want to send soldiers out to, change the world and democratize the world. So,
another question here is Bush had Baker and Nixon had Kissinger. Can you talk about what, could they have accomplished what they accomplished without their advisors, Baker and Kissinger?
Right. Actually, Baker was not that important for the first Bush, but Scowcroft was. Okay, remember Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor? He was the most important advisor for Bush. And the Bush memoirs are Bush Scowcroft memoirs. In fact, I used them last week in my class. Baker was a good friend of Bush. He put him in the State Department. But Baker actually was a dog when it came to the first Gulf War, unlike Bush. So the question is a good one, though. So how much did the advisors help? I'd say, they both knew, they were both very experienced, Nixon and the first Bush. They kind of pretty much knew what they wanted to do in most cases. So, and Bush was only in there for 4 years, Nixon for longer. So I think at the end of the day, they could have done things on their own, pretty much along the lines that they did. That's my impression. Having said that, if you want to read some good memoirs, but you don't have to, but more interesting than my book, the Bush Scowcroft memoirs are good. They're kind of a diary, so that both men kept. And then the Kissinger memoirs are really kind of, a monument. 3 volumes, about 1,000 pages in all, but they're awfully good, I must say. I've read them. So,
right.
But by the way, the other good memoirs, if you're interested in them, Atchison, the Secretary of State for Truman, wrote some very literate, well-written memoirs. And then the best presidential memoirs, I think, are by Ulysses S. Grant, by all accounts. I was just glancing at them the other day for the first time. They're written very well. So they're considered the best presidential memoirs.
Well, I haven't. I've read Grant's, but I haven't read many of the others. But Grant's is actually remarkably well written.
They are. They really are. Yeah. He
for that.
wrote them in the cottage of my great uncle, by the way, Drexel. But anyway, but no, they are. You're right. And the president didn't begin to write memoirs until really right until Truman, with the exception of Grant.
Right.
So you got regular memoirs then.
Well, what have been Biden's big successes, do you think? Is he's going to be a 4-year president. So
Right.
what do you give him credit for at this point?
Okay, well, let's look at Afghanistan. I think, reasonable people could differ about whether to stay in Afghanistan or not. We were losing about 20 soldiers a year in, 2019 or so. So that might have continued. But reasonable people could, I think, make an argument we should have withdrawn, which is what he did. No one will defend how the withdrawal was organized, and so he has to take some blame for that. I think what happened is he had become a dove on Afghanistan going back to 2010 or so, and so he thought it was just we'd get out of there, especially after the Bin Laden raid. I'm sure. And so I think he just lost interest. He made a decision early in the administration, told the military, get out by August. This is like April of 2021. And then the military said, well, if you don't, they wanted to stay, by the way, in small numbers. But they must have said to themselves, well, if he doesn't care anymore, we don't care either. We'll just get out as quickly as it can to save casualties. And so the whole thing was not well organized. Okay. But you could say, he withdrew from Afghanistan. You could see that as a plus. I think his reactions to both major wars that are going on now in Gaza and Ukraine have been reasonably good. I'm sure not all of you agree with that. But that's just where I happen to come from. I don't think he could have couldn't have headed them off. But I think they were reasonably good in how he's conducted U.S. policy. So I would give him, I'd give him a B, a B, A, B, C, D, F, B before grade inflation, as a president.
What about his dealings with Taiwan and China and the South China Sea?
Right.
Focusing on Asia for a minute here.
Right. I think again, he's been pretty reasonable, kind of a centrist mainstream view on pushing back against China. China, I think, is they're certainly on the rise. Major countries, when they're on the rise, as China is now, they tend to push to the limits of their strength. And what you want to do is you want to push back if you're a kind of status quo power, as the US is pretty much. You want to push back without pushing into actual conflict. So I think Biden has done a fairly good job on that. By the way, I spoke to a China expert a couple of weeks ago. He told me during the Biden administration, when the Chinese first began to make their move in the South China Sea, it was the Obama administration. They started to push into it, as they continue to do. And someone asked, a US official asked them, years later, so what's the background on all of that decision making? And he apparently said, the defense chief, who said, well, we began to push in there waiting to see what you would do. And so you didn't do anything. So we continued to push. I don't know whether it's that simple, but I don't know. I was kind of, my breath was taken away when he told me that.
Well, then I'm looking at your analysis of Afghanistan. Doesn't Trump deserve the credit for getting out?
Not really. I know he agreed to a plan to get out, right? And under the negotiator Khalilzad. But Biden could have thrown that into the basket, huh? That was it wasn't a treaty, which has legal import. So I think what Trump was doing was was playing it both ways. He was wanting to get political credit for deciding to end the war, but he wouldn't formally end it until his second administration. So it wouldn't interrupt the election. It wouldn't undercut him in the election, because it was always possible, and this happened, that you could withdraw from Afghanistan and all hell would break loose, which it did at the airport. And so you wanted to admit presidents, starting with Obama, I think, their heart wasn't really in the war anymore. But they didn't want to completely pull the plug because, it's a lot of people relying on the US, and it could cause chaos, which it did. So, I know that Trump negotiated that agreement with the Taliban to completely withdraw, but at the end of the day, it was Biden's decision whether to carry forth on it or not.
Well, do you see this then as Obama could have ended it? Do you see that as a foreign policy failure on his part?
Well, to be fair to him, I mean, we could have had a scenario there where we would have stayed there indefinitely. And we'd probably lose about 20 soldiers a year. We could have kept the government in power in Kabul. We could have kept it in power, and defend women's rights and control the major cities. But every year you'd never completely defeat that insurgency, and every year you'd be losing about 20 men. So you could, argue that you would want to, completely pull the plug. And in retrospect, ideally, maybe we should have left once bin Laden was killed, which after all was the main reason for us to be there. We decided to stay on because we said to ourselves, what if the Taliban, comes to power and the same thing happens again? They allow a new bin Laden to run around and do whatever he wants. So that was the thinking. And, when Obama came to power, there were about, I don't know, 50,000 plus soldiers there. If I had to do it over again, I would have said he should have withdrawn right then. He would have brought the whole thing crashing down, of course, which it eventually did.
Right.
But I think, in fairness to him, that would not have been an easy decision to do. So our failure is too strong. I think it's a missed opportunity.
Right. It looks like in some ways there's a second term itis here, in that Nixon pushed off Vietnam until after the election,
Right.
and you're suggesting that may have motivated Trump to push it off until after the election. Maybe Biden failed to follow Nixon and Trump by example.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is completely right. Completely right. Now, there's another questioner who asks correctly. It wasn't the financial cost in Afghanistan and Iraq. Wasn't that a major fact? Wasn't that a major downside? And the answer, of course, is yes, you're right. Spending lots of money that, ended up going into the sand in many cases. And remember, even though we were trying to bring socioeconomic progress to that country, including women's rights, and all of that's true, it came with it a war, and wars hurt people. So hurts the civilians as well as, the soldiers involved. So I can see the US intervening there in order to try to, to find bin Laden, although you never know how long it's going to take. It took 10 years. But, once we got him, it was probably time to leave. Although, again, you'd have people pleading with us to stay.
Right.
And, you know,
Well, first, I want to tell people if they have any questions, they can use the chat function. There's also a function at the bottom to raise your hand if you want. And
I can't see anyone, by the way.
well, I can see, no, but I can see everything here.
Okay, okay.
And if not, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question uh, physically, and I can see some of you, most of you have darkened or have canceled your video, so I can't see you. But if you have your video on and you want to answer, raise your hand and ask a question, now would be a good time if anyone wants to press on with questions. Anyone else have a question? Carol, you've been doing a good job here. Do you have any questions? No more? Okay. I have a one that's always, I've never really decided what's the correct answer, but I've never studied this like you have. And that is, there's always this criticism that presidents who haven't been in the military don't appreciate the sacrifice and the loss of life and the things like that. And so it's easier for them to send people into conflict, and also they're slow to remove them because they've never experienced that battle hardened mentality themselves. Clearly Washington, Grant, Roosevelt wasn't, of course, in war. Truman was, Eisenhower was, Nixon was, Kennedy was. I mean, we can go on with it, but I mean,
Right.
did you see anything that in your looking at this that would answer that statement that I just made?
Right. Well, that's a good question. And so I think so the question is, does actual combat experience cause people to be more cautious or more aggressive?
No, I wouldn't say actual combat experience
Okay.
because like Nixon, I think was stationed in
Yeah,
Ottumwa, Iowa,
that's right.
pricing tires. So,
Right, right,
but
right, right. Well, okay, experience in the military.
right.
Um, I think I don't know if you're looking back over the entire historic record, I think it's probably a plus if you've been in the military, although you tend to be maybe see a very narrow, slice of military life. But you at least know um, a bit about how the military works. You can be maybe overreact to something, like some people who were in Vietnam, maybe, and I saw this when I worked on the Hill, they'd be against any kind of military commitment thereafter because they saw everything through the Vietnam lens. So you can overreact to things. Also, it can go in the other direction, though. If you had been in the military, say, in the first Gulf War, you might think, well, everything's a piece of cake and easy to do. So I don't know. I think overall maybe it's kind of a wash, but it's probably, I think a plus if you experience military, being in the military. And, most of our leaders today, are not, haven't done that. Yeah, so, and you like in the Obama administration, if you read Secretary of Defense Gates's memoirs, which are very good, he served, under the second Bush and under Obama, Secretary of Defense, and he mentions how often Obama was surrounded by really young, kids in their 30s from the Hill who would be telling, the Defense Department, do this, do that, send a unit here, send a unit there. And they just have no idea that it's not that easy to do. You can't just snap your fingers and move 500 troops, tomorrow and to place A, B, or C. So there was quite a bit of frustration on his part because of the amateurishness. So it's
Well, I happened to years ago when they were doing the invasion of invading Kuwait,
right.
and I happened to get on an elevator with one of Henry Kissinger's, who had been a Henry Kissinger aide, then had gone on in the State Department to a great career. And I asked him about what did he think about going into Kuwait, and he said that we always make the mistake of going in without first having a plan for how we're going to get out.
Yeah. Well,
And I
do you
thought
remember?
that was a very
Right. Do you remember the name of the person?
oh, it'll come. Unfortunately, it'll come to me. You would know
Doesn't
him, I'm
matter.
sure.
Yeah, it
But
doesn't matter. Yeah,
uh,
you don't want to you know, you try to there's a nice quote that I use in my book, and it's the quote is prudence is the god of this lower world. Prudence is the god of this lower world. That's a quote from Edmund Burke. Edmund
okay,
Burke was a right of center conservative in the English Parliament in the 1790s. Um, and he was warning about not thinking through policies and their possible implications. That, for example, the commitment to Afghanistan, was it, how likely was it going to be that we could create a stable government there? Well, one big minus was that next door in Pakistan, the Taliban could use that as a sanctuary. We couldn't go into Pakistan. The Pakistanis didn't want us in Afghanistan, particularly. And so if they had thought about it, they would have thought, I think, we probably can't really make a go of this in terms of creating a long-lasting government because we're right next door to a country that doesn't really want that, or it wants its own long-lasting government on its own terms. So anyway, just an example of maybe not thinking through
all right.
policy.
We're going to end the program with one last question from Judy Berman, and basically it's how is this info war and propaganda? Uh, uh, how do you see that affecting our foreign policy? What influence do you see that the modern artificial intelligence, the websites, this whole new electronic era?
Right. I'm not an expert in this field, to say the least. It's being used to muddy elections, as we all know. The Russians in particular is seeding, disinformation to try to push directions in the ways that they like. So you're going to get a lot of that, I think, from here on out. I hope the Chinese never do that, in an excessive way. The Russians tend to be more in your face than the Chinese, but maybe that'll change over time. We don't know. Whether it will impact foreign policy itself, um, I'd like to think not. You know, so but we'll see. The AI, people wondering it could affect the defense policy, and there's thought about what if there's all these machines, they can think more quickly than human beings, and to end up fighting, is it machine versus machine, at some point in the future. So there's a lot of that kind of speculation going on now.
Yeah, of
After
course.
all, when we fly across the Atlantic in a civilian airplane, I guess from what I understand, there's computers that are doing a lot of stuff already. So it may go increasingly that direction in terms of
And,
warfare.
and of course, what we don't know yet is how much our government, the CIA, et cetera, is using these same weapons on other democracies. It's a two-way street for this
Uh,
type. We've
well,
used we've used
yeah,
propaganda, not in generations past, to
yeah,
influence elections in other countries. So This isn't
Yeah,
really new, it's just a new method there to do it.
yeah, we have. So you're probably thinking a lot about Latin America and
Right,
in Europe after World War II.
right,
Yeah, yeah, there was a lot of that fighting, the communist movements in various countries. Um, I don't think they're doing so much of that now. I mean, because you don't have these monolithic communist movements like you used to have,
right,
but at least not that I'm aware of.
right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. This has been very interesting.
Oh, sure.
I want to thank everybody. We had a large turnout tonight.
Mhm.
And we'll see you on October 7th when we're going to have, I hope, a very interesting discussion on the immigration system. I know I need a lot of the last time I had immigrants in the family was in the 1870s, so I think I need an update on how it works. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope all of you will think of questions to ask at that time because I know I have a lot of questions. So with that, good night to everybody.
So long. Thanks for the,
Good night and thank you.
sure, thank